Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in History, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm your host, Michael Vann of Sacramento State University, but please call me Mike. Today, my guest is John T. Seidel, and we'll be talking about Republicanism, Communism, Islam, Cosmopolitan Origins of Revolution in Southeast Asia, out with Cornell University Press in 2021. Professor Seidel received his BA and MA from Yale and his PhD from Cornell University. He was fortunate enough to have been mentored by both James C. Scott and Benedict Anderson. I'm very jealous. He is the author of Capital, Coercion, and Crime, Bossism in the Philippines, out with Stanford in 1999, Riots, Pogroms, Jihad, Religious Violence in Indonesia, out with Cornell in 2006, and The Islamist Threat in Southeast Asia, a Reassessment, out with Honolulu's East-West Center in 2007. He has also co-authored Philippine Politics and Society in the 20th Century, Colonial Legacies, Post-Colonial Trajectories, and Thinking and Working Politically in Development, Coalitions for Change in the Philippines. Professor Seidel was previously at the School of Oriental and African Studies, but since 2004 has held the Sir Patrick Gillam Chair in International and Comparative Politics in the Department of Government and International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Seidel, John, if I may, welcome to New Books in History.
Many thanks. Thanks for having me.
So I've been following your work over the years, and I'm really excited to chat with you.
Same.
And before we get into republicanism, communism, Islam, cosmopolitan origins of revolution in Southeast Asia, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself? Looking at your personal website, I was amused to learn that we both initially pursued Russian studies, but also both ran away to Southeast Asia. My story is that I flunked out of Russian 3 and also realized that the weather, food, and surfing was much better in Southeast Asia than in what was then the Soviet Union. But tell us how you became a Southeast Asianist. What drew you to the region? I'm sure your reasons are much more profound than mine.
No, I think my reasons are probably more disreputable and reflect badly on me, perhaps as many sort of white middle-class American men who end up in Southeast Asia. So I was very seriously interested in Russia and the then Soviet Union, and I studied Russian in high school. I spent the summer between high school and university in Moscow and Leningrad studying Russian. I kept studying Russian throughout university and even took a course called something like Sovietskaya Publicistika, where we read and discussed, the latest, developments in the Soviet press about Gorbachev and what was happening then. I used to have a subscription to Pravda. So I was, really into it. But then the story is that my high school girlfriend, my high school sweetheart, her father-in-law became the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines. And so with her invitation, I ended up in Manila in the summer of 1985 with an internship in the political section of the embassy, thanks to this nepotism, and a top secret security clearance.
Really?
And the interesting thing is this, this great book, classic book by Jeffrey Race, War Comes to Long On, was given to me by my boss in the political section of the embassy. And he'd served in Saigon in the U.S. Embassy there in the early 70s and had overseen what they called a kind of provincial reporting program on the Viet Cong, the communist insurgency in the provinces.
And that's the same years as Operation Phoenix as well.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. He's mentioned in that Frank Snepp book, Decent Interval, this guy. So he's from that era, this guy. And he had sort of biked and driven all around the Philippines. And he took me to different provinces and kind of trained me up in terms of how to interview people, and then said, you're going to write War Comes to Laguna Province, which is a province just southeast of Manila, where, by mid 1985, if you drove in an embassy car to any little town in this province, you'd see the town was splattered with red graffiti that said, long live the New People's Army, and, overthrow the U.S. Marcos dictatorship, and so forth. And I spent the whole summer, weeks and weeks trying to get people to talk to me in these little towns in this province, and wrote up a report on the province. And then I came back over, I was in Washington, D.C. in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and then back in the embassy in 1987. So I spent my summers doing this kind of junior Cold Warrior, sort of intelligence gathering research. And it was fascinating. And so I found it more interesting than the Soviet Union, even in the era of Gorbachev, on the eve of its dissolution. And
right. So you're there in 85. Is the People Power kicking off yet?
People Power is in February of 86.
Right.
And then I'm in Washington as a kind of junior intelligence analyst in the summer of 1986. Return in 1987, by which time the U.S. Embassy is deeply involved in promoting counterinsurgency, and the CIA station is vastly expanded. And my kind of research is now kind of somehow problematically implicated in all of that, and the places I travel to during those weeks and those months are likewise, including Davao. So, by the end of this, I think my idea of working for the U.S. government is coming into increasing kind of conflict with, perhaps I would like to think, my innate sense of morality, but also the influence of people like Jim Scott and my classmates at the time, who were studying the Philippines and other countries in Southeast Asia. So I decided to become an academic instead, and was really still fixated on the Philippines and on local politics in the Philippines. So I ended up doing my PhD research on two provinces in the Philippines, looking at, how was it that if at the national level, the dictatorship under Marcos was overthrown in 1986, that at a local level, sort of mini Marcoses were still dominating local politics.
Mm-hmm. And then, that's how you got interested in the Philippines. But with this book, you're really a Southeast Asianist. You've written on Indonesia as well. How did you expand across the archipelago and jump the national boundary between the Philippines to Indonesia?
Yeah, that's another story. So I was in a class studying Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia, as an undergraduate, while I was interested in the Philippines, because they didn't have Tagalog at Yale, and so I studied Indonesian with a bunch of people, some of whom went on to be famous Indonesianists like Jeff Winters, and Jeff Hadler, the late Jeff Hadler. We were classmates there. And so that drew me into, studying Indonesian politics. We would read articles out of Tempo magazine about, the Tanjung Priok incident and Benny Murdani and all the sort of latest developments in Indonesian politics. And so I got hooked on that as well. And then in the mid-1990s, after finishing my research in the Philippines and beginning teaching at the School of Oriental and African Studies, I ended up beginning to travel to East Java and ended up spending a year in Surabaya in 1997, 1998, the final months of the Suharto era, looking at what it began to evolve as a pattern of rioting that then spread to different parts of the country and then morphed into new forms of religious violence after the fall of Suharto in 1999 and thereafter.
And that became riots, pogrom, jihad.
Yeah.
That's interesting that you were in the Philippines in 85 and there was a big change, and then you were in Surabaya in 97 and then there was a big change.
Yeah, there are some people who have unfounded suspicions about me. But I guess, the bigger picture is a more narrowly conventional academic picture that I went to graduate school, and even as an undergraduate, studied with a lot of people and learned a lot about Southeast Asia by reading books and sitting in seminars and listening to lectures, and got interested in the region as a whole and was taught by great people and, felt inspired.
Yeah, and I mean one of my frustrations with some Southeast Asianists is, and it's because of language and because of existing historiography, is that many of us have an interest in the region as a whole, but because of disciplinary sort of boundaries, we get siloed into studying a nation state. And of course, Anthony Reid, Ben Kiernan, there's a whole host of great scholars that do Southeast Asia wide stuff. But most of us really get funneled into being a Filipinist or being an Indonesianist or being, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, maybe. Or actually, I think Thailand, Cambodia, Laos is the AAS breakdown. So I really love works like this that transcend these national boundaries and look at the region as a whole. So this book again does this great job of looking at different countries and looking at Southeast Asia as a whole. So what's your elevator pitch for this book? What's your short explanation of what you wanted to accomplish?
Well, if this is a pitch to make in an elevator with someone, I hope it's in a tall building with a Southeast Asianist, because the book is written for Southeast Asianists, really, rather than political scientists or people interested in revolutions per se. And I think the book is written with this in mind, that Southeast Asian studies, it seems to me, is distinctive as a kind of area studies field for two kinds of preoccupations. One is with the kind of authenticity or indigeneity of Southeast Asians, that they aren't just, second-rate, Chinese or Indian or, Catholics or communists, that all of the different ways of understanding the region that might see it as, a less what's the word? Complex, sophisticated, grand, great civilization as China or India next door, historically, have led the Orientalists to say, well, wait a minute, no, there is something very special that requires very specialist knowledge about the region, that is not just a matter of imitation, of emulation. And the most obvious example of this would be Clifford Geertz's The Religion of Java. But I think much of Southeast Asian history, Southeast Asian studies in general, has that kind of emphasis and that inclination to try and say, oh, there's something genuinely local here that you need to understand, and to hold on to that. And the second thing is a preoccupation with nationalism that's understandable in the Cold War era. And when I came into Southeast Asian studies, you still had, a very recent history of Southeast Asia specialists opposing, resisting the Vietnam War, U.S. intervention in Indochina, and really politically trying to show American and other audiences that resistance to colonialism and imperialism couldn't simply be dismissed as, communism and fellow travelers, and that there was a kind of powerful nationalist streak in Southeast Asia and among Southeast Asians that animated recent Southeast Asian history. And this then sort of builds up into the context in which Benedict Anderson's book Imagined Communities emerges as a classic that transcends Southeast Asian studies and becomes one of the most important books in the study of nationalism and more broadly. And I think what I'm trying to do in the book is to suggest that that perspective that comes out of Southeast Asian studies has, by the turn of the 21st century, been at least challenged or complemented by an alternative kind of perspective, a kind of coherent template that Imagined Communities presents for understanding Southeast Asian history as the emergence of national consciousness and of new nation states. That there's an alternative picture that a range of historians have actually individually and collectively presented as an alternative picture, one in which we see Southeast Asians, and here's the elevator pitch punchline, Southeast Asians are not simply ineffably Southeast Asian, distinctively Javanese or Tagalog or Vietnamese, and they're not deeply nationalist and patriotic, but they're also incredibly cosmopolitan. That Southeast Asians are, people of the world, and they have been for centuries, and they've made incredible contributions to world history in the process. And that, in this era of globalization, of course, somebody inevitably was going to come along and write a book like this. It just happened to be me, but someone else would have written it anyway, that stresses this kind of thing. Because in fact, historians have written these kinds of stories now for 20, 30 years, and I'm just pulling them together.
Well, okay, so that was the elevator in the Petronas Tower in Kuala Lumpur.
Yeah, sorry.
That was not the the third floor of Harrods, or I don't know, does Harrods have an elevator?
Yeah.
I assume they have an elevator.
Probably, maybe 6 floors.
Yeah, but so I mean, I think I think the book is really valuable for world historians, and I'm going to strongly recommend it to other card-carrying members of the WHA. I think you do a fantastic job of what so many of these volumes on Southeast Asian history try to do, like Lockhart's Southeast Asian world history. You always got to put Southeast Asia in the world to sort of justify its importance to non-Southeast Asianists. So I think this does a fantastic job in several different registers, and is really of value to anybody interested in history of global economic integration, revolutionary movements. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So many things of value to world historians. Mm-hmm. But in regards to the study of revolution, what did you want to disrupt, challenge, or revise in terms of traditional narratives of revolution in Southeast Asia?
Well, I think if you look at the studies of these 3 revolutions, the Philippine, Indonesian, and Vietnamese revolutions, that I think there's a distinctive, picture that's kind of nationalist and nationalized, that these are understood as national revolutions for independence, led by nationalists for, nationalist reasons. And I think, if you read Imagined Communities, then you must come away with a great deal of doubt about this, insofar as Anderson tells us that the only people who could possibly be imagining themselves as Filipino, Indonesians, or Vietnamese as such in that kind of nationalist way by the eve of these revolutions would have been small numbers of educated and somewhat dandyish men. And
Filipino Ilustrados being the classic example.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly. And so then that raises the question about what about the broad mass of the population that participates, and that the foot soldiers, the people who are waging the revolution through mass mobilization, armed mobilization. How did they get drawn into this? How did they think of themselves if they couldn't possibly have thought of themselves as nationalists, at least at the outset of these struggles? So what explains that, and how did they get mobilized? And also, how can we explain the differences between these countries in Southeast Asia, some of which see a revolution, a lot earlier than the others, like the Philippines, the turn of the 20th century before anyone else, and then other sort of mid-20th century revolutions happening in Vietnam or Indonesia, alongside countries where a much more suppressed or staged managed pattern of political change and decolonization is unfolding, like in Malaya or Malaysia and Singapore, as they become.
So you're a political scientist, but this book
uses. To call me that.
I don't. Well, I didn't put scientist in scare quotes, so that wasn't that bad. But there's you use a lot of history in here, more than other works in political science that I've seen, and I think you, in the acknowledgments, you mentioned taking a historical turn. And each of the chapters offers really a longue durée, like a long, not just it's like a longue durée political history, a longue durée economic history for each of the countries in question. Why was it so important for you to take this really hate this term, but sort of this deep dive into the history of these case studies, much further back than comparable works of political science on 20th century revolution.
Yeah, I think for me, the whole discipline of political science has long been and has increasingly become a field of study where a kind of economistic form of thinking prevails. That politics, operates like it's imagined that markets operate, with sort of disembedded individuals, as sort of consumers and producers and political entrepreneurs and the like in a kind of political market. That's how it's imagined, and that allows for a certain kind of, game theoretic modeling, and it allows for quantification. But that rests on what the kind of premise that that I would associate with Margaret Thatcher and her famous saying that there's no such thing as society. And my sense is that there is such a thing as society, and if we look at Southeast Asia, that we should be contextualizing politics, as in other parts of the world, as embedded within societies, and societies that are historically constructed, rather than cultures. And for me, this is perhaps a way of thinking about the potential for Southeast Asian studies, a kind of comparative historical sociology of Southeast Asia, in which you see that, societies are formed, religious institutions, social classes, states are formed in different ways, and that those differences matter. They shape the parameters of the possible for politics, in different ways, so that Indonesian politics and Philippine politics are different in ways that you can only understand if you have that contextualization. So for me, that kind of that a deep dive, it goes back to perhaps studying Barrington Moore and other comparative historical sociologists as an undergraduate, and being much more intrigued by, impressed by, interested in that kind of comparative politics form of political science than anything more pseudoscientific along the lines of the discipline of economics, which is now prevailing, especially where I teach at the London School of Economics and data science. I mean, political science. Sorry.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That shout out to Barrington Moore. I remember as an undergraduate in political science classes going, oh, this is the kind of political science I like. And again, that sort of economistic or quantifiable strand of political science. I read a lot of political science, trying to keep up with Southeast Asian studies. And, I read the case study and then sort of flip through the that section of the book. But this I really, really appreciated. And I thought that your analysis was so nicely interwoven with the narrative account. It wasn't like you were just presenting the data set and here's your analysis. So I thought it was a real triumph there. So the book looks at three revolutions: the Filipino, Indonesian, and Vietnamese. As a whole, what is the overall significance of the Southeast Asian revolutionary tradition or traditions to the larger world? I think you say something to the effect, I don't have the exact quote here, but this is one of the most important regions in the world to the history of modern revolutions.
I say that, and I think that there's some evidence for that in the following ways. So, but it's not because there's a single kind of revolution. It's in the variety that we see in these three revolutions. So if you look at the Philippine Revolution at the turn of the 20th century, it has shades of the American revolutions, both North and South American revolutions of the late 18th, early 19th centuries, and also some shades of the kind of 1848 style revolutions, and the sort of back and forth moments that you find earlier and later in French 19th century history. And so that's a distinctive mode of doing revolution that's there kind of on the eve of what, who's the sociologist at UNC Chapel Hill, I'm blanking on his name, who writes this book about democratic revolutions in the early 20th century, these kind of republican revolutions that you see in Iran. You see in the Qing dynasty in China, you see in Russia with its distinctive outcome and so forth. I think there's that. And it is of great inspiration to Chinese intellectuals. So the Philippine Revolution, the historian Rebecca Carl has shown, was of great interest to Kang Yu-wei and Liang Qichao and other people like that.
Yeah, and that makes me think of Nicole Swinjing Boitiz's recent book, Asian Place, Filipino Nation, about the Philippine Revolution and the way in which Chinese intellectuals and revolutionaries really were inspired by the Philippine example. But
yeah, she has that's a great book that I wish I had read or knew what she was up to as I was finishing mine. And she shows various kinds of linkages and connections across East Asia that I am ignoring or overshadowing or was in various ways ignorant of as I was writing. So her book is really great.
It works with what you're talking about, and I think really bounce up. And listeners, by the way, a little self promotion here. Go into the back catalog of New Books in History, and I did a podcast interview with Nicole on Asian Place, Filipino Nation. But I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah, great book. I recommend it highly. So the Philippine Revolution has that significance for Chinese intellectuals, and it also draws the United States into Asia in ways that have really world historical consequences. If you think of American empire in Asia, if you think about World War II and so forth, I think that's significant. The coincidence of the revolution with the end of Spain's empire in Cuba and then in the Philippines. Then the Indonesian revolution, it seems to me, is in a way of a piece with a whole set of struggles that you find across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, more or less simultaneously, that Robert Malley calls third worldist, and that we see sort of gathered together for better and for worse in Bandung in 1955, that kind of third worldist and non-aligned movement style of kind of loosely, avowedly anti-imperialist, anti-colonial revolutions that involve a measure of mass mobilization, but are perhaps messier and less monolithically organized than, say, the Vietnamese Revolution, and that have their own distinctive features and problems and pathologies that Robert Malley's book, The Call from Algiers, talks about in ways that are insightful, if problematic. And then lastly, the Vietnamese Revolution, I think is of world historical significance as a, not only as a Communist Party-led armed guerrilla struggle that then draws the United States into its infamous forms of intervention in Indochina with all sorts of consequences in American history and for world history. But also, if you take the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and then eventually the North Vietnamese invasion of South Vietnam in 1975, we could see that there's a conventional element of warfare. There's no exact equivalent to Dien Bien Phu that we see in other anti-colonial struggles, in other such revolutions that I think is distinctive and in some ways sets Vietnam apart. But when Che Guevara,
in terms of a massive military success, you mean, or
in terms of a kind of set piece battle,
right?
That you don't really see in Algeria or any other such struggle. But when Che Guevara in 1965 says, we're going to give you 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams, everyone knows what he means. And Vietnam is a country, of course, but he's alluding to it as a revolution that has that kind of knock it to him kind of success story quality to it, as far as a certain kind of anti-imperialism and one led by communist parties and other revolutionary socialists. So in these three very distinctive ways, I think you could make a case for Southeast Asian revolutions as at least exemplifying different forms of revolution on the eve of and throughout the 20th century, but also leaving in their wake a whole set of major world historical kinds of contributions and consequences.
And then, as your book shows, there's all these incredible connections, people, organizations, ideas. I mean, just like that was, a main contribution of the book. And in your analysis, you say that when you talk about these revolutions, you want to denationalize, internationalize, and transnationalize these case studies. So what do you mean by each of these terms, and what are the distinctions between denationalize, internationalize, and transnationalize?
Good question. They are intertwined, and the denationalizing thrust of the book, I think I already alluded to in some measure by noting that I find that this kind of nationalist template of struggles that are led by nationalists for nationalist goals to be analytically inadequate, because it doesn't allow us to understand how the broad mass of the population was mobilized if their imagining of the nation was, is really hard to imagine, or if it's an assumption too far.
It explains it explains the Illustrados or elite Vietnamese nationalists, like Nguyen Thai Hoc, or the VNQDD, or Sukarno and his circle in the 20s and 30s, but doesn't get to the vast majority of the country or the colony or the region, right?
Yeah, and exactly. And then if you look at the available set of explanations that then you see coupled with that elite nationalism, so the Pemuda in Java that they mobilized in some measure, inspired by some kind of traditional notion of Javanese power, or that there was some distinctly Tagalog notion of kalayaan, or freedom, as Ray Leto tells us in his book Passion and Revolution, or Alexander Woodside's account of sort of Vietnamese sort of culture and consciousness as being more profoundly sort of self-conscious and self-confident than other countries. It doesn't really stand the test of comparative analysis or even historical sort of process tracing. So, the most stunning example there is the book by Christian Lentz about Dien Bien Phu, where he shows that this incredible victory by the Viet Minh is only possible because of the coolie labor and assistance of tens of thousands of non-Vietnamese speaking coolie laborers on the one hand, and then we know from other sources of Chinese advisors, Chinese logistical support, Chinese strategy, and Chinese military assistance on the other. So there's that analytically, and then politically, there's also the urge on my part to denationalize these revolutions, insofar as to treat them as nationalist ends up enabling a kind of official nationalist and nation state kind of appropriation of these successes. And that's problematic.
Hello, everybody. This is Marshall Poe. I'm the founder and editor of the New Books Network. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably love to read. I know I do. So I'd like to recommend you subscribe to Scribd. Scribd is the ultimate reading subscription service, letting you explore all of your interests in any format you choose: ebooks, audiobooks, magazines, and more for only $9.99 a month. All your favorite things are there. You get an entire library for less than the cost of a single book. No complicated credit cards or additional purchases required. If you're not sure what to read, Scribd combines the latest technology with the best human minds to recommend content that you'll love. Want to change things up? You're free to switch between titles, genres, and formats at any time on your phone, tablet, or computer. And here's the best news. Right now, Scribd is offering NBN listeners a free 60-day trial. Go to try.scribd.com/NBN for your free trial. That's try.scribd.com/NBN to get 60 days of Scribd for free.
The book internationalizes.
It's the post-colonial states create these teleological narratives, right? That remove a lot of the also-rans and the important side currents. I mean, I think Kwe Tamahotai does this really well in her book on radicalism and the origin of the Vietnamese Revolution, like in the 20s and 30s, like people that are written out of the official history coming out of Hanoi, but were definitely part of this intellectual and political ferment in that time period, of which I think one of her aunts or great aunts played a role.
That's right. In that other book.
Yeah, that wonderful book on, I forget what it's called, but it's Wei Tam Hotai about a murder case where her aunt.
Yeah, it all takes place in Guangzhou and then in Saigon.
Yeah. I mean, it's really resonates with your story. But I'm sorry to interrupt. So denationalize, internationalize.
The book internationalizes these revolutions insofar as it situates the moments, the conjunctures in which these revolutions unfold. Against the backdrop of various international conflicts, world wars, and so forth. Most obviously World War II, with all of its complex consequences that vary very significantly between Vietnam and Indonesia. In the case of the Philippines, there's the Cuban Revolution, but there are a whole set of other international conflicts and forms of inter-imperialist competition that are also there in the background. So there's that kind of backdrop, and also more generally, what I was talking about earlier of a comparative historical sociology. It's not as if each and every one of these countries kind of autonomously develops its own historical sociology, within some kind of hermetically sealed domestic, firewall. But instead, these societies that emerge, these social formations that are already emerging in the early modern era, if not earlier, they're created through long distance trade and war and interaction that is international, if that's the right word. Perhaps it's anachronistic for much of this period. And then transnational or transnationalizing these revolutions by showing how solidarity networks and broader kinds of mobilizational and discursive linkages and infrastructures and blueprints for making revolution were crucial. The Freemasons in the case of the Philippine Revolution, clearly the Communist International, the Comintern, and various elements of that in the case of Vietnam and in Indonesia, but also Islam in the case of Indonesia. These are all transnational dimensions of these revolutions that are crucial.
Well, that leads me right into the next question I was going to ask you about cosmopolitanism. And in this very, very historically informed discussion, you stress the cosmopolitan nature of each of these revolutions, but also of each of these societies. And this, sort of circling back to what you were saying earlier about the cosmopolitan nature of Southeast Asian-ness, right? So you talk about different forms of cosmopolitanism, ranging from Sanskrit, Sinophone, and Latin cosmopolitanisms to Catholic and Islamic cosmopolitanisms, as you just mentioned, Masonic and Marxist cosmopolitanisms. What's the significance of cosmopolitanism as a concept for you, and how does it work in your analysis of these Southeast Asian revolutions?
That's a tough question, especially because there are whole bodies of literature and political theory to which some of my colleagues have interestingly contributed. About cosmopolitanism, in political thought, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not really in touch with and au fait with that literature. So I'm really talking about cosmopolitanisms in two distinct kind of phases and in two distinct kinds of ways. So the first kind of cosmopolitanism draws its inspiration from Ben Anderson's Imagined Communities, where he suggests that prior to the arrival and expansion of nationalist forms of imagining and of community, that you find what he describes as forms of cosmopolitan belonging that are essentially religious, perhaps, and that he grounds, in concrete terms, in the languages, the sacred languages of, say, Latin or Pali or Sanskrit, and classical Chinese, and classical Arabic, and he suggests that insofar as people imagine themselves as part of supra-local communities, translocal communities, these would have been these forms of cosmopolitan belonging that are, whether they're religious or civilizational and so forth. And since he wrote the book, we can see in Sheldon Pollock's work, in Ronit Ricci's work, and in other scholars' work on the so-called sinosphere, that people have begun to develop this. And in my case, for the book, I think what impresses and interests me most, and what I find is most important for setting the stage for and understanding the different outcomes of these three Southeast Asian revolutions, is something more specific. And that is, if you look at so-called Latin or Catholic cosmopolitanism, there are certain specific institutions of the Catholic Church, and then certain specific institutions of education and socialization that evolve over time and expand into forms of education and forms of communication, including by the late 19th century, what people call the Jesuit Republic of Letters, or that extend beyond the control of the Catholic Church into, other forms of education and expression and association, beyond the control of these religious orders, and morph into, Masonic lodges or, free thinkers or forms of education that are in tension and conflict with the Catholic Church, and certainly the more conservative the orders during this late 19th century period. In the case of Islam, we see that Islamic educational institutions and Sufi lodges as well, but educational institutions, the madrasa, evolve and expand over time, and then by the turn of the 20th century morph into new forms of modernist and reformist experiments in terms of Islamic education, and that these forms of education and socialization are likewise very significant in terms of the infrastructure they provide for organizing and mobilizing in the Indonesian Revolution and before then, in terms of educational and associational activity and translocal linkages. And then finally, in the case of Vietnam, we can see that the inheritance of a system of sort of classical, so-called Confucian education, in classical Chinese philosophy and literature that is passed on over the generations and has a complex history, that system is then abolished certainly by the second decade of the 20th century, and the elimination of that infrastructure of cosmopolitan, scholastic endeavor and socialization and identification. The elimination of that eliminates a kind of conservative and also distinctly patriarchal bulwark against something else that then, in terms of available infrastructure and organizational tools, does not have the same sort of counterweight or countervailing power that the Indonesian communists find during the revolution in the form of Islamic schools, Islamic leadership, Islamic discourse, Islamic associations, and so forth. There's nothing like that thick on the ground as of 1945 in Vietnam as a kind of counterweight for communist organizing, because of what you don't have anymore, And there's nothing in terms of so-called traditional Vietnamese religion that would also have that ecclesiastical or institutional form either to counter, an infrastructure for making revolution that's grounded in revolutionary socialism, Leninism.
And of course, Marxism is also an attack on the olds, right? So that historic form of Sinitic Confucian, whatever you want to call it, cosmopolitanism, that's in the crosshairs of the young Marxist revolutionaries, or maybe middle-aged Marxist revolutionaries at that point.
And just so I don't lose my train of thought, because I said there were two things, so the second thing is that by the late 19th century, the deepening integration of Southeast Asia into the world economy makes for this incredibly cosmopolitan public sphere by the turn of the 20th century in all of these port cities and, in their hinterlands, the market towns. And we see this in terms of the mix of different kinds of people who are there. We see this in forms of popular entertainment that are wonderfully hybrid in their influences and their languages and so forth. And we
tell us about that example there of the popular entertainment with the in the, I think started in Surabaya, right?
The comedy Istanbul that Matthew Cohen has written about so colorfully. We get this great account of these forms of popular opera or drama and music that are that really stem from the Parsi community in Bombay, and that travel across the Indian Ocean into Southeast Asia and incorporate a sort of wonderfully hybrid set of different influences into these popular performances that Matthew Cohen tracks across Java and beyond, and we know in the Malay Peninsula as well, are really attracting growing audiences by the turn of the 20th century. So you get a picture by the early 20th century or the late 19th century in the Philippines of port cities and market towns where news and information and influence and literature and expression it is really in so many different ways cosmopolitan. And if you think of the sort of Chinese and Indian and other Arab immigrant minorities and their crucial role in intermediation in these local economies, that's just part of a bigger picture of really disparate, diverse influences in everyday life.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the deep economic history you offer and the way in which these societies are drawn into different forms of global economic systems. But I think you touched on it there. But I just want to tell the listeners, this was a real pleasure for me in reading this book. As a card-carrying member of the World History Association, I just love this stuff because it's not just this, I teach this sort of dry economic history of global exchange and so forth and increasing global connections. But here it is operating on the ground. And we go into the music hall and we see the educated Javanese youth rubbing shoulders with a Chinese merchant and some Dutch sailors who found their way in there, and they're watching the performance of maybe a version of Shakespeare or something where, I think you referenced that they were performing the Merchant of Venice and trying to make sense of the Shylock character in the port town of East Java, and just the incredible levels of cultural and intellectual interaction produced by these deeper long-term economic systems that we describe as the world systems. I found that the coming together of several different intellectual strands that I work with into this dance hall, into this performance. I thought that was great.
And I mean, I guess the part of the reason for me to dwell on that is to note that kind of public sphere, that emergence of different kinds of modernity in all their hybrid cosmopolitan forms, that there's a great deal of open-endedness about where this might go. And you see against the backdrop of these emerging forms of modernity and sort of modern public sphere and sort of all these forms of popular expression, entertainment, and consciousness, you do see new forms of cosmopolitan, if that's the right word, better than transnational. It's anachronistic, forms of mobilization and association, and new forms of associational activity and politics that are linked, across the oceans, that are transoceanic or transcontinental in their linkages and in their sources of inspiration and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in the book, you tie that to these larger economic structures, such as development of plantations, connections to global shipping and trade. And the way you wove all that together, I just found so incredibly useful. And again, I'm going to be flogging this book to my fellow world historians, saying this is one that you should read that really puts Southeast Asia into these conversations that we're having. You have a really interesting literary device. You start each of the case studies not in the country in question, but far away. Indeed, rather far away in some times. You start talking about the Philippines from the perspective of a small Czech town. You talk. Your story of Indonesia begins in Baku, in the Russian Empire of all places. The Vietnam section begins in southern China, but then in the space of a paragraph or two, I think you take us to West Africa. What are you up to here? Aside from exhausting the reader as we grab our atlas or our globe, what were you doing taking the reader on these journeys, these circuitous routes to get to these Southeast Asian revolutions?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, what was I doing? I guess you could say I was just procrastinating. As I was just having fun, goofing off, learning about these parts of the world. And rather than diving into the task of telling about these revolutions that other people have written about and researched more deeply than I have. So there's that. I guess I would wager a guess. There's a little bit of that. But
you got to show off your Russian language skills.
Yeah, that was fun. That was fun to get.
I was suitably impressed when I got to that section. I'm like, wait a minute, he's citing the Russian text in the original? Wait. Went to your personal website. I'm like, okay, he's got Russian. Well, I'm suitably impressed.
It was nice to get back to the Russian, and I needed it actually.
Yeah. But by the way, years ago, I think as an undergrad, I picked up a copy from the early 1960s. It was from the guided democracy era of an Bahasa Indonesia primer in Czech and English. So you can, I was thinking I could learn Indonesian and Czech at the same time, but it was that moment of international socialist collaboration. But I digress.
Yeah, I mean, there are Indonesian Czech connections also, but I did have some specific points to make in each one of these seemingly random digressions. So in the first case, the Philippine Revolution, I begin in this town outside Prague in what today is the Czech Republic. And in a way, you could say I'm showing that even in this far-flung frontier of global Catholicism, there are these connections. There's that. But I'm also making a point about this town that Filipinos, if they've ever heard of it, or if scholars of the Philippines have heard of it by its German name, Leitmeritz. And this character, Ferdinand Blumentritt, who is the close correspondent and, sort of sympathizer and supporter of Jose Rizal in the late 19th century, is thought of as an Austrian. And there's no mention of this being a, increasingly Czech-speaking town, and in fact, a town where Czech nationalism has a certain kind of development in the late 19th century. So it has a sort of special history in that regard. And yet, revealingly, Blumentritt, who's a great supporter of Rizal, is no friend of Czech nationalism. He instead favors a kind of German-speaking, liberalism in the late the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and this, I think, really for me is quite relevant because it shows how his sympathy and support for Rizal was not based on a support for nationalism, but a shared kind of liberalism, perhaps republicanism, but certainly liberalism instead. So that there's that kind of element of the story. In the case of Baku, there's something closer in a way, in the sense that there's a parallel between Baku as this crossroads of revolution in the early 20th century and what becomes the Soviet Union and Iran, and also the Ottoman Empire as it dissolves. But also as an industrial town, with a significant and in some measure significantly Muslim working class, wage-labored working class, industrial working class, something that the Indonesian archipelago almost uniquely in the Southeast Asian context, not quite, but almost uniquely also has, with its industrial scale plantation belts and its incredible network of railroads by the early 20th century.
And budding oil industry.
Yeah, and the oil industry emerging as well. And I think that parallel then combines with the famous Baku Congress of the Peoples of the East in 1920 to allow me to bring together these two strands of the story of the Indonesian Revolution in the book, which is of Islam and communism, two potentially powerful bases for mobilization against imperialism, against colonialism, which have the potential to combine, but then end up in conflict instead. And we see that at the Congress of the Peoples of the East, and then in the subsequent Comintern Congresses in Moscow a few years later. So that's the excuse for Baku. And then finally,
Tan Malaka, early PKI leader, he's not in Baku, but he's at the Comintern conferences trying to make this pitch for linking Islam and communism, and that's stemming from as you lay out the Sarekat Islam tradition and the left faction of the Sarekat Islam. Is it Sarekat Islam Merah?
Yeah, and the Sarekat Rakyat.
That Marxist tradition, which gets written out of a lot of history in Indonesia. My friend Bonnie Triana, who runs Historia magazine in Jakarta, is always talking about that, and they were trying to make the argument to fellow Indonesians, look, hey, Sarekat Islam had this Marxist component, and that many of those members saw themselves as good Muslims.
Yeah,
and good Marxists, and that was possible, right? Yeah. Impossible to imagine in a post New Order Suharto education, right? That most of the scholars have, that's just impossible. But as you lay out in the book, and as Bonnie does in his work, this was a thing, and it embodied in these spirits of Baku and Tan
Malaka. Yeah. So that's Baku, and then lastly in the Vietnamese chapter, and to link back to your point about the world economy, it's the case that the book, among other things, tries to show how the process of integration of these different parts of Southeast Asia in the world economy does not unfold through simple dyadic colonial sort of pulls to the metropolitan community, but how in fact the sources of investment and the linkages of trade go in all sorts of other directions as well. So in the case of Vietnam, what you see is that the Vietnamese and Indo-Chinese economy is closely linked with that of southern China, and in particular Guangdong and Guangzhou, so that it's, as it were, no coincidence that kind of linkage is there, just as Rizal ending up in Europe and ending up in near my neighborhood here in London for a time, or in Germany, is a reflection of the prevalence of British and German firms over far more significant than Spanish firms in the late 19th century in the colonial Philippines. So that helps to set the stage for Guangzhou, where, as there was a great deal of revolutionary agitation and activism as a base for a succession of different movements and operators, especially from the 1920s onwards. that were crucial for the making of revolution in Vietnam. But then I also briefly mentioned the capital cities of what became Benin in West Africa and Madagascar off the coast of southern Africa as other cities of relevance because of the close connections that Vietnamese revolutionaries like the man we know as Ho Chi Minh developed with African anti-colonial activists in Paris in the 1920s, the way in which he, as they, thought about the importance of what they called intercolonial collaboration, and the way in which the Vietnamese Revolution, as it began to unfold between 1945 and 1954, intersected with French struggles to hold things together in the African possessions of the empire. And again, in economic terms, how some of the profits developed from French exploitation of Indochine and economic activity in southern China were then recycled into investments and activities in Africa. And the shipping routes began to reflect this, so that Ho Chi Minh, by the time he arrived in Paris, had spent weeks and months passing through African ports and working with Africans on the shipping routes. So there's that kind of underlying economic logic there that's also worthy of note.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really appreciated is that, you start off that chapter in that discussion of the Vietnamese Revolution, making these connections between Madagascar and West Africa, and then through Ho Chi Minh's trajectory, we go to Paris. We see his work with La Paria, and that his consciousness there is yes, Vietnamese Revolution, but really pan anti-colonialism, right? You talk about the articles he writes on French colonial abuses in Algeria and West Africa, and that's all part of his consciousness. And then fast forward a couple of decades to, I think it's 47 or 48, and
47.
The Viet Minh are making a big military push, and they're able to get the upper hand at one point because the French have to divert troops from Indochine to Madagascar, and that throughout these anti-colonial struggles, there is this transnational or sort of pan-colonial or pan-subaltern. I'm not quite sure what the right term would be, but they're working together. At one point, they're sort of sharing different parts of the struggle against the French Empire at this later stage. The way you tied those together, I just thought was really enlightening and really fascinating.
Well, thank you. I mean, but I should reiterate that it's all building on the research of other scholars who've shown this, who've done this incredible research, connecting these different disparate struggles and people and places.
So speaking of the end of revolutions, one thing I noticed is that you sort of stop around the point of formal political independence for Indonesia or Vietnam, or with the establishment of American rule in the Philippines. But these revolutions carry on. Sukarno famously spoke of Revolusi Belum, the unfinished revolution. And the Vietnamese communists took their country through a series of revolutionary turns in the 60s and 70s and into the 1980s. And then, famously, Zhou Enlai is supposedly quipped to Nixon that he would have an opinion on the French Revolution once it was over. Sadly, it appears he was talking about 1968, not 1789. But sometimes the story is better than the actual facts. But
I prefer the apocryphal story.
Yeah. But I guess what I'm getting at here is how do we say a revolution is over, and what was what went into your decision making on when to sort of stop your analysis?
It's a great question, and in a way, the book that that owes so much to Ben Anderson gives him appropriately the last word. I think, quoting him, because he talks about the aspiration for 100% merdeka, 100% freedom that is there whatever that might mean. I mean, what would 100% freedom look like anywhere and to anyone? That we see in the Indonesian Revolution unrealized. And he ends his book on Java in a Time Revolution with this idea that the hope for that is still with us. And he's writing in 1972 when we know the Suharto military dictatorship is suppressing all sorts of hopes for freedom. So, I think it is something that, I am trying to deal with more elusively than extensively and explicitly in these three cases. But I think I have an answer in each case. So in the case of the Philippine Revolution, part of the puzzle about Philippine history, if you think of it in purely nationalist terms, is why you get the first revolution, supposedly nationalist revolution in Southeast Asian history, and then you don't get all that much in terms of nationalist mobilization, push for, the overthrow of American colonial rule, and you have a fairly well staged managed decolonization that leaves the Philippines looking very neo-colonial in many critics' eyes. And I think the book suggests quite consistently with its account of the Philippine Revolution as a revolution that's really a liberal, perhaps Republican revolution overthrowing crown and church, as a revolution whose kind of leaders and main protagonists end up, in a sense, winning. They may be defeated by the United States very violently, but they're then incorporated and empowered under a regime in which the Catholic Church has been relegated to the role of a kind of civil religion, has lost its lands, its monopoly over education and control of the public sphere, and its role in sort of dictating the terms of local politics. And in which the ruling class can rule. These local worthies, local notables, local Chinese mestizo landowners and merchants who are represented in the revolution, they then triumph under American rule, and they're still running the country today.
In a way that they wouldn't have been able to under Spanish rule?
Well, they were still constrained by the Catholic Church and the religious orders in particular. And this is, just as in parts of Europe, including Spain, that kind of tension and conflict means a sort of back and forth between liberal and conservative modes of politics in the late 19th century. That's the real struggle in the Philippines. So yeah, they needed to throw off the shackles of the church in the form that it assumed in terms of power in the late 19th century Philippines. In the case of Indonesia, I think that slogan of Sukarno's Nasakom, in which nationalism, agama or religion, and communism were conveniently united under his leadership, that in a sense captures what he then tries to hold together and impose following independence. But what we see is in a way, the extinguishing of the emancipatory energies and mobilizational potential for these forms of politics that were so diverse and mobilized, and in some localities very revolutionary, anti-aristocratic, violent, disruptive, egalitarian in different ways during the revolution, and then are over the 1950s and 1960s either